Emily Rebecca Lambert was a 30-year-old elementary school teacher living in Garland, Texas. She worked at Henry Elementary School, where she taught math and science to third-grade students. Her colleagues describe her as a dedicated educator who enjoyed her work and consistently brought energy and care into the classroom. Students responded to her warmth, and her commitment to their learning made her a valued part of the school community. Teaching was not simply a career for Emily. It was a calling that allowed her to inspire young minds and create a sense of stability in her own life. Outside of her professional role, Emily was first and foremost a mother. She had 2 young daughters whom she loved deeply. Although divorced, she maintained a positive and respectful relationship with her ex-husband, Donovan Lambert. Rather than allowing separation to create hostility, Emily and Donovan cooperated in raising their children. Emily frequently expressed gratitude toward him as a father, recognizing his ongoing role in their daughters' lives. Her devotion to her children reflected her determination to provide them with consistency and love, regardless of personal circumstances. Emily's family background also shaped who she was. She was a daughter of Stephen and Donna Koenig, a close-knit couple whose strength and faith guided them through previous hardships. Years earlier, they had suffered the devastating loss of their son in a car accident. The tragedy left a lasting mark on the family, yet also forged resilience. Emily's parents carried this resilience forward, offering their daughter support as she built her own life and career. Their relationship was strong, and they remained a steady presence for her and their granddaughters. At the time of her death, Emily had been in a relationship with Robert Early, an oil rig worker based in Carlsbad, New Mexico. The relationship had lasted only a few months, but it marked a new chapter for Emily as she explored companionship following her divorce. Her parents last spoke to her shortly before she traveled to visit him, unaware of the tragic events that would unfold. Emily Lambert's life was defined by her roles as a teacher, mother, and daughter. She was more than the circumstances of her death. She was a woman whose dedication and love touched those around her. In early March 2014, Emily Lambert left Garland, Texas, for a weekend trip to Carlsbad, New Mexico. She planned a visit to spend time with her boyfriend, Robert Early, who worked on a local oil rig. The trip was an opportunity for them to enjoy each other's company after months of a long-distance relationship. Emily's parents last spoke with her on Saturday, March 1st. During that call, she sounded cheerful, describing her day and sharing that she was enjoying herself. To those closest to her, there was no indication of anything unusual. That same day, Emily and Robert spent time sightseeing and shopping. The couple appeared to be having a pleasant outing, a normal weekend together. Later in the evening, they went to the Blue Cactus Lounge, a bar in Carlsbad. Inside the bar, however, tension surfaced. Reports later indicated that an argument began after another man allegedly flirted with Emily. What may have started as a small disagreement quickly escalated. According to Robert's initial account to police, Emily left the bar on her own following the argument and never returned. He stated that she walked away, leaving him behind, and he had no knowledge of what happened next. On March 2nd, he formally reported her missing. His version of events presented the situation as though Emily had simply chosen to leave. For investigators and her family, this created uncertainty. In the hours following the report, hope remained that she might reappear unharmed. As law enforcement began to look into the case, however, contradictions appeared. Surveillance footage in the hotel where Emily and Robert had been staying showed details inconsistent with his claims. The images suggested discrepancies between what he told police and the timeline of their night. These inconsistencies shifted the perception of the case. What began as a possible voluntary disappearance soon raised questions about whether something more serious had occurred. For Emily's family, the waiting period was filled with anxiety. What was supposed to be a short trip to visit her boyfriend had turned into a troubling mystery. The last confirmed moments of Emily's life were now connected to a night out, an argument, and a story that failed to match the evidence. On March 4th, 2014, the search for Emily Lambert came to a heartbreaking end. After days of uncertainty, authorities discovered her body on a quiet ranch in Loving, New Mexico, just outside of Carlsbad. She was found face down behind a barn, lying in the dirt, wearing only her bra. The scene revealed immediate signs of violence, leaving no doubt that her disappearance had turned into a brutal crime. The shock of the discovery spread quickly. Emily, a 30-year-old teacher and loving mother, had vanished only a few days earlier. Her parents and children had been clinging to hope that she would come home safely. Instead, they received the devastating news that she had been killed in a horrific manner. The autopsy results painted a grim picture of her final moments. Emily had suffered severe blunt force trauma to her head. Her body showed scrapes and bruises, proof of a violent struggle. Most haunting of all, investigators found rope burns around her neck. Evidence showed she had been tied and dragged across the ground while still alive. The brutality of the injuries revealed the extreme violence she endured in her last hours. The rope, the dragging marks, and the trauma to her head gave detectives vital clues. This was no accident, and it was not the act of a stranger who suddenly appeared. The evidence pointed towards someone close to Emily in those final hours, someone who had been with her that night. For the Carlsbad community, the news was chilling. For her family, it was devastating beyond words. Emily's disappearance was now officially a homicide case, and all attention turned toward Robert Early, the man who had been with her on the night she vanished. The discovery of her body changed everything. What had started as a missing person search was now a murder investigation, fueled by the shocking violence revealed in the forensic findings. From the moment Emily Lambert vanished, Robert Early's explanations wavered and twisted under the weight of scrutiny. At first, he told investigators a simple story. After their argument at the Blue Cactus Lounge on the night of March 1st, 2014, Emily stormed out of the bar alone and never returned. He framed her absence as a decision she had made, suggesting that perhaps she needed space or had chosen to leave Carlsbad altogether. But the cracks in his version of events appeared quickly. Surveillance footage from the hotel contradicted his claims. Witnesses also noted inconsistencies, and police began to see his story as less an account and more of an excuse. Under growing pressure, Robert changed direction. This time, he spun a bizarre tale about a mysterious large man in a cowboy hat. According to Early, this stranger had left with Emily and, after some kind of confrontation, accidentally killed her with a metal pipe. Early claimed he panicked and fled the scene, distancing himself from responsibility. The story sounded desperate and implausible, and investigators knew it. To make matters worse, Robert's behavior during Emily's disappearance raised even more red flags. While family and friends were frantically searching, he posted a smiling photo of himself and Emily on Facebook, as though nothing were wrong. To those who knew her, the gesture was jarring, and it only deepened suspicion about his state of mind. By March 4th, detectives subjected Robert to a polygraph test. He failed. The results, combined with his erratic behavior and contradictory statements, left investigators convinced that Robert was hiding the truth. His lies no longer shielded him, but instead pointed directly toward his guilt. This section of the story captures the unraveling of Robert Early's deception. Each new explanation contradicted the last, and instead of creating distance between himself and the crime, his words drew him closer to it. Surveillance evidence, forensic findings, and his shifting accounts revealed a man scrambling to protect himself, but ultimately exposing the violence and betrayal that led to Emily's death. After days of weaving lies, shifting blame, and creating elaborate diversions, Robert Early finally broke under the weight of mounting evidence. Investigators had already pieced together enough contradictions in his stories to press harder, and during questioning, Early admitted to a version of events far more brutal than anyone had imagined. He confessed that the argument between him and Emily Lambert at the bar did not end when she supposedly stormed off. Instead, the fight escalated violently. In a rage, Early admitted he repeatedly kicked Emily in the face and head until she collapsed, unconscious but still alive. What began as a drunken dispute had transformed into a horrifying act of violence. Not knowing what to do, he placed her in his vehicle and drove to a remote, desolate location outside town. But instead of showing any mercy, Early continued his assault. He revealed that he attacked her again using an air pump from his car, striking her while she lay defenseless. The cruelty of his confession stunned investigators, but what came next was even more chilling. Early described tying a rope around Emily's neck, fashioning it into a makeshift noose, and attaching it to the vehicle. Believing she might still be alive, he dragged her across the ground, inflicting unimaginable pain and injuries until eventually leaving her behind in that secluded area. Later, in an effort to hide what he had done, he returned to the site to move or discard evidence, actions that only deepened the deliberate nature of his crime. His confession painted a picture of calculated brutality, revealing not only the physical violence he inflicted, but also his cold attempts to mislead police and Emily's loved ones throughout the investigation. The shocking details highlighted the extent of his cruelty and the desperate lies he had spun in the days following her disappearance. For investigators, the admission was both a breakthrough and a haunting moment. The long hours of interrogation had finally forced the truth into the open, but the reality was more horrifying than the fabrications they had spent days untangling. The case had moved from suspicion to certainty. Robert Early had confessed to the murder of Emily Lambert. In May 2015, Robert Early, then 33 years old, stood before a New Mexico courtroom to face the consequences of his actions. After months of investigation, forensic analysis, and repeated hearings, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and tampering with evidence. The verdict was clear and decisive. Robert Early would spend the rest of his life behind bars without the possibility of parole. The courtroom atmosphere during sentencing was somber and heavy. Members of Emily Lambert's family sat silently, their faces reflecting years of grief that no legal outcome could ever fully erase. For them, the trial had been a painful reopening of wounds, as each disturbing detail of Emily's final hours was replayed through testimony and evidence. Yet, when the judge delivered the life sentence, there was also a small measure of relief, an acknowledgement that justice had been served, and that Robert would never again have the chance to harm another person. During his sentencing statement, Robert addressed Emily's family directly. His words were brief but striking. He admitted that the guilt of what he'd done had become a living nightmare, haunting him every day since Emily's death. He expressed remorse, apologizing to the family for the pain he caused. While some in the courtroom may have questioned the sincerity of his apology after his many lies and attempts to evade responsibility, it was the first time he openly acknowledged the truth without fabrication. The judge emphasized the severity of Robert's crimes, underscoring the brutality of the murder and his repeated attempts to mislead investigators. The life sentence without parole reflected the gravity of the offense and the state's determination to ensure permanent accountability. Robert Early was transferred to the Lea County Correctional Facility in Hobbs, New Mexico, where he would remain for the rest of his life. For Emily's family, the sentencing did not erase their loss. Closure was difficult to define, and no verdict could restore the life that had been taken so cruelly. Still, knowing that justice had been delivered provided some measure of peace in the long, painful aftermath of tragedy. The murder of Emily Lambert left an unhealable wound on those who loved her most. For her parents, Stephen and Donna Koenig, the loss was almost unbearable. Years earlier, they had already endured the heartbreak of losing their son in a tragic car accident. Emily's death forced them to relive that nightmare, only this time under circumstances so violent and cruel that they struggled to comprehend the depth of what had happened. At first, the Koenigs were shielded from the most brutal details of Emily's final moments. Investigators spared them from the horrific confession that Robert Early eventually gave. But as the case moved forward and more information came to light, they inevitably learned the truth of what had been done to their daughter. That truth left scars that could never fully heal. Emily's ex-husband, Donovan Lambert, also bore an enormous weight. Despite their separation, he remained deeply connected to Emily, especially to their two young daughters. Suddenly, he was faced with the unimaginable task of raising them alone, while protecting them from the harshest details of their mother's death. Donovan became both parent and protector, carrying forward Emily's love through his devotion to the girls. In Garland, Texas, where Emily worked as an elementary school teacher, the community was shaken. Students, parents, and colleagues mourned the loss of a woman who had dedicated her life to children. Classrooms fell silent as news spread, and vigils were held to honor her memory. Her parents turned to faith and community for strength. They created a Facebook page to update friends, family, and supporters, often sharing messages of resilience and hope. One post read, "The essence of Emily is with God." Those words became a guiding belief for the family as they navigated the pain. A memorial fund was also established for Emily's daughters, ensuring that her legacy would support their futures. Donations came from across the community and beyond, symbolizing how far Emily's kindness and spirit had reached. The crime was not just a legal case or a headline. It was a human tragedy that left a family grieving and a community mourning. Yet, even in their grief, Emily's loved ones demonstrated remarkable strength, ensuring that her memory lived on in faith, in her children, and in the countless lives she touched. On June 9th, 2022, concern turned into terror for Heidi Null when she had not heard from her 22-year-old daughter, Lucy Leasy Dodd, in more than 15 hours. The silence was unusual, and Heidi decided to go to her daughter's apartment in Alton, Illinois. With the key in her hand, she entered, expecting perhaps an explanation or at least some reassurance. Instead, within minutes, she rushed back outside in shock, overwhelmed and unable to process what she had just seen. Her trembling voice carried to the 911 call, a recording that captured the desperate confusion of a mother who had found her daughter's body. When officers arrived, Heidi was still on the front steps, shaken and barely able to speak. She handed them the key and waited in silence. Body-worn cameras documented the moment police stepped inside. What they found was beyond comprehension. Lucy's body was lying in the bedroom. At first, it seemed her head might have been covered by a towel. But as they drew closer, the grim reality became clear. She had been decapitated. Lucy had been 8 months pregnant with her unborn baby, affectionately called Bean by her family. The violent act had not only taken her life, but also the life of her child. As investigators surveyed the apartment, one more chilling fact emerged. Lucy's head was missing from the scene. The killer had taken it, leaving behind a crime that defied understanding and deepened the horror. The discovery shaped every step of the investigation. For officers, it was not only about documenting evidence, but also about confronting brutality rarely seen. For Heidi, it was a moment that her world collapsed, and the start of a long search for answers about who had done this and why. The night before Lucy Leasy Dodd was discovered, a sequence of events unfolded that would later become central to the investigation. It was just after midnight on June 8, 2022, when security cameras captured a man walking across a quiet street in Alton, Illinois. His face was obscured, his clothing different from earlier in the evening, and in his hands he carried a white laundry basket. The man walked behind a smoke shop and disappeared from view. Minutes later, another camera recorded him again, this time discarding the basket into a red dumpster filled with construction debris. At the time, it seemed unremarkable, but the footage would later hold devastating significance. While the cameras recorded his movements outside, neighbors inside the building were listening to sounds that deeply unsettled them. They heard muffled yelling, not loud enough to be clear, but distinct enough to suggest pain. The yelling was followed by heavy thuds that shook the apartment walls. Some neighbors later described the sounds as rhythmic, almost like chopping wood. Then came a period of screaming, intense and prolonged, before it suddenly stopped. Silence replaced the chaos. The neighbors hesitated, unsure if they were witnessing another argument or something far more sinister. Believing it might simply be another fight, they decided against calling 911. The following morning, construction workers at the dumpster noticed what the cameras had already recorded. Inside the scattered clothing, they found shoes stained with blood and a short, serrated knife. Both the shoes and the weapon were marked by red smears that stood out against the debris. These discoveries became the first physical evidence pointing toward the violence that had taken place inside Leasy's apartment and the lengths the killer had gone to hide it. Lucy Leasy Dodd's life was defined not by the violence that ended it, but by the kindness and generosity that shaped her from an early age. Born in 1999 in Alton, Illinois, she grew up as someone who consistently gave more than she received. Even as a child, she showed an unusual sense of compassion. On her 10th birthday, instead of asking for gifts, she requested that friends and family donate to an animal shelter. That simple act reflected the values she carried with her into adulthood. After graduating high school in 2017, Leasy worked at Dairy Queen, saving money while considering her next steps. Her goal was to follow her mother into the medical field, a path that would allow her to combine her dedication to helping others with a stable career. Co-workers and friends remember her as someone who radiated warmth, a young woman who made others feel seen and valued. In early 2022, Lizzy's focus shifted as she prepared for motherhood. When she learned she was expecting her first child, she embraced the responsibility with excitement. Her family gave the baby an affectionate nickname, Bean, and together they began preparing for the new arrival. Invitations to the baby's shower had already been sent, and her mother recalled the joy of gathering small items for the child's future. Although she had not yet chosen a name, Lizzy felt she still had time. For those who knew her best, Lizzy's life was filled with love, care, and hope. She was remembered as a daughter, a friend, and a mother-to-be whose presence left an impression on everyone around her. Her loss was not only tragic, but deeply personal for all who cherish her. Lucy Lizzy Dodd's relationship with DeAndre Holloway was troubled from the very beginning. Those closest to her described it as volatile, unstable, and marked by constant conflict. The couple frequently moved between different places, at one point even living in a tent, a detail that reflected the instability woven into their daily lives. Friends, neighbors, and family members noticed how often arguments escalated, leaving visible signs of violence on Lizzy. Her mother, Heidi, recognized the dangers early on. She feared the relationship could end in tragedy and kept daily contact with her daughter, either through phone calls or text messages. Despite these efforts, the cycle of abuse continued. At work, Lizzy's co-workers at Dairy Queen observed injuries that were difficult to ignore. She often arrived with black eyes, initially explaining them away with excuses, such as her dog jumping up on her. Eventually, when pressed, she admitted that the injuries were a result of fights with DeAndre. In 2021, the violence escalated to a point where Lizzy required hospitalization. She was admitted with a broken nose and 2 black eyes, the result of another attack. In a text to her boss, she revealed the reality she was living in. She wrote that her boyfriend had beaten her again, forcing her to stay with her mother for safety. Lizzy also admitted that he had threatened to harm him before, and authorities encouraged her to stay in a safe place. Yet despite the severity of the abuse, she repeatedly returned to him. This pattern, bruises, apologies, reconciliation, and renewed violence, became familiar to those around her. Friends and family offered to call police, but Lizzy resisted, choosing instead to shield DeAndre from consequences. She clung to the belief that he might change, a hope that blinded her to the danger she was in. Tragically, the decision to let him back into her life one final time set the stage for the events that would soon unfold. On June 7, 2022, Lucy Lizzy Dodd faced another turning point in her troubled relationship with DeAndre Holloway. That day, he abruptly disappeared without explanation, leaving behind confusion and despair. For Lizzy, who was 8 months pregnant, the sudden absence felt like abandonment. She turned to her mother in a series of text messages, voicing the fear that he had left her for good. The weight of the situation overwhelmed her to the point where she admitted to self-harming, cutting her leg as a way to cope with the distress. In her words, she confessed that she felt she could not get it right, a heartbreaking glimpse into the pressure and hopelessness she carried. Despite this emotional spiral, the following day Lizzy tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. On June 8th, she continued with small routines, washing her work clothes and staying in touch with her mother. Yet beneath those ordinary actions was a deep unease. She expressed to her mother that something felt wrong, an instinctive warning that her circumstances were not safe. Even as she went about her day, the fear never left her. That evening, DeAndre returned. His uncle brought him back, and by 9:11 p.m., security cameras recorded the pair walking into the apartment together. This footage became the final visual evidence of Lizzy alive. From the car, she sent her last text message to her mother. "I'm trying to figure out." It reflected both her uncertainty and her fragile hope that things might improve. By the following morning, she would be dead. The escalating fear, her vulnerability, and the false promise of reconciliation led to the tragedy that ended her life and the life of her unborn child. In the hours immediately following the murder of Lucy Lizzy Dodd, DeAndre Holloway began a series of actions that revealed both his attempts to conceal the crime and the disturbed state of his behavior. Just before midnight on June 8th, security cameras recorded him leaving the apartment once again. This time, he was not empty-handed. In his grasp was the same white laundry basket that neighbors had noticed earlier. Inside was Leesy's severed head. He walked across the street and carried the basket behind a nearby smoke shop before discarding it into a red dumpster filled with construction debris. What appeared to be a simple act of disposal was, in reality, a chilling effort to erase the evidence of his crime. A few hours later, around 2:30 a.m., DeAndre arrived at his family's home. Witnesses recalled his demeanor as nervous, pacing back and forth in agitation. His unease was so visible that relatives immediately sensed something was wrong. In the bathroom, he began cutting off his dreadlocks. When questioned about a sudden change, he told them it was for a fresh start. To his family, the explanation seemed inadequate and alarming, especially given the intensity of his behavior that night. What drew even more concern was the discovery that he carried items belonging to Leesy. Among them were her debit card and identification. These objects, now in his possession, left little doubt about his connection to the crime. Relatives who observed this behavior later provided testimony that would become critical for investigators. Together, the discarded basket, the drastic haircut, and the stolen personal items formed a pattern that pointed directly to his guilt. His actions not only failed to conceal the truth, but also exposed the desperation of someone trying to cover what could not be hidden. On June 10, 2022, 2 days after Lucy Leesy Dodd was found, police in Gillespie, Illinois, arrested DeAndre Holloway. The arrest was not initially connected to the murder. Officers detained him on a cannabis-related charge, unaware that they had the prime suspect in Leesy's killing in custody. It was only later that his identity and involvement would come into focus. In the holding area, his behavior quickly drew attention. Surveillance footage showed him restless, pacing the floor, shaking his legs, and appearing unable to remain still. At one point, he asked officers if he could stand up and walk around, then laughed and ignored their instructions to sit. His conduct escalated further when he began banging his head against the wall. Officers warned him to stop, but he continued, alternating between laughter and erratic movements. During these moments, he made threatening remarks toward those around him. Among the disturbing statements were repeated threats to decapitate officers, words that echoed the brutality of the crime committed just days earlier. At this stage, investigators were still piecing together the details, but his threats reinforced the violent tendencies already evident. When moved to jail, his behavior became even more uncooperative. He refused to provide basic information, including his own name, and disrupted hearings he was required to attend. On some occasions, he declined to leave his cell, forcing officers to intervene physically in order to bring him into court. These actions complicated the legal process, delaying proceedings and raising further questions about his state of mind. The footage and testimonies from officers became essential in establishing a record of his erratic and dangerous behavior. What had begun as a routine arrest quickly revealed the presence of the man responsible for Leesy's death. Following his arrest, the legal process surrounding DeAndre Holloway was prolonged and fraught with obstacles. Prosecutors had a clear case against him, supported by physical evidence, witness accounts, and surveillance footage. However, progress slowed when DeAndre was declared unfit to stand trial. He was transferred to a state institution for evaluation and stabilization, with doctors tasked to determine whether he could participate in proceedings. The delays stretched on as his behavior continued to disrupt the process. In court, he frequently refused to cooperate, sometimes declining to attend hearings altogether. On other occasions, he disrupted proceedings with outbursts or outright refusal to comply with basic instructions. Each delay prolonged the anguish for Lucy Leesy Dodd's family, who waited for accountability. His stepfather, Chris, spoke publicly during this time, emphasizing that DeAndre had long suffered from mental health issues and that the system had failed to provide him with adequate treatment. While acknowledging the severity of the crime, he argued that underlying illness played a role in what had unfolded. For prosecutors in the court, the focus remained on ensuring he could eventually face justice. After years of interruptions, DeAndre entered a guilty plea in 2024. With the plea, the case avoided a full trial, but the admissions confirmed his responsibility for Leesy's murder and the loss of her unborn child. In January 2025, sentencing brought a measure of closure. DeAndre received 60 years in prison. For Heidi Null, Leezy's mother, the outcome carried mixed emotions. She expressed relief that he admitted guilt and would be incarcerated long enough to prevent further harm. Yet no sentence could restore her daughter or grandchild. In court, Heidi honored Leezy and Bean, urging others to recognize warning signs of abuse and not remain in harmful relationships. The day that should have celebrated a baby shower became instead a memorial. The sentencing acknowledged the crime, but for Leezy's family, the loss remained immeasurable.